Hello, crafty friends. My name is Jessica, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I have a card for you using some of the products from the newest Simon Says stamp release called the Splendor release. I'm going to be using some of the positively saturated inks, as well as this lovely Easter and clover set and this hippity hoppity stencil. So let's get started. When I think about Easter cards, I love having this teal blue color included in creating them. And when I saw this hippity hoppity stencil, I knew I wanted to try to do a offset technique with it. That's where we stamp with Versamark ink or some kind of embossing watermark ink. And when you use watermark ink like this through a stencil, it's going to create just a slightly darker color than your paper. This is going to be the base of the shadow. So we're going to go ahead and make sure that we get all this Versamark in there. I am using a twisting technique as I'm pouncing with this foam dauber all over. And I also did re-ink my Versamark stamp just to ensure that it was extra juicy and so that I could make sure that the ink was getting in between this very thin stencil. Now it's hard to see from far away, and there were a couple spots that didn't show up, but that's okay because we're going to be able to cover those up and you won't notice them. But now that we have this panel on here, I'm going to go ahead and clean my stencil really quick. I do use squeaky clean to clean my stencils, just like pretty much everything else I use to clean. And we're going to offset it slightly from where we just put down the Versamark ink. And that's why you see my hair, so I apologize for that. But we're just looking down through the stencil. I got it lined up and then I moved it slightly to the right and then slightly up. Now we're going to go in with a white pigment ink, and this is going to highlight this stencil while the Versamark ink, because it's offset, is going to give us that shadow, and it's going to be a really fun text font situation happening. Now I enjoy a good drop shadow, and this is the effect that you're going to get with using the Versamark first and then slightly offsetting your stencil. Look at that. Love it. It's very subtle, especially for these thin letters, but you do get that technique. Now I'm using the Simon Says Stamp White Pigment Ink Pad, and I like this one because it comes with reinker as well. So I went ahead off camera and I dried this panel using my Wagner heat gun, and here's a close-up of it. How fun is that to have that little bit of a drop shadow? You could also use a ink color that's similar to your card panel. That probably would have been less messy, but I just love the effect that you get with the Versamark ink pad. Now, I knew I wanted to include this beautiful Lots of Luck stamp set from Simon Says Stamp, and I absolutely fell in love with these clover flowers. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and stamp in white pigment ink, and this is going to create a base, and then over top of it, I'm going to stamp on it with dye ink. So I'm only going to use the base stamp set from the flower, and we're going to go ahead and dry it because you don't want to stamp your ink on top of that white wet pigment ink because then it'll become muted and not be a crisp image. So I am in the habit of trying to get all of my ink pads re-inked, and so you'll see here that I have this one re-inked, but I'm struggling with getting a clear image. Looking back at this now, it is because I'm stamping on a flat surface with a solid stamp. With solid stamps, you gotta want to make sure that you're stamping on a softer surface and that it has a little bit of give so that that stamp pushes into the paper and you're going to get a better coverage that way. So you'll see once I start stamping on this actual panel, it's going to be completely smooth and there's no little embellishments or little offset white marks when I'm stamping. I do get a little off kilter there with that one, but it just creates another little drop shadow. For these clover colors, I'm using the trio from the Positively Saturated ink line with Simon Says Stamp, which includes Bubblegum, Sweets, and Taffy. I have done a color blend series with these inks, and I will locate a comment card up in the upper right hand corner to direct you to that playlist. I am going through all of the Positively Saturated ink trios and creating color blends and really explaining why I love those inks and how great they are. So we're just finishing up with the last layer on these clovers. How fun is that you took a stenciled background and stamped on top of it, and by using a white pigment ink base, you've created a one layer card that almost shadows the text underneath completely. You can see some of it, but it created a nice base where it's looks like you're not stamping on top of a stenciled image. Now, I did not use a white base for the stems, and you can see that white ink coming through really, really strongly. But I knew it was going to be hard to line up those little tiny stamps, so I did decide not to. But I like the texture that you receive by not using the white underneath. Next, I knew I wanted to continue with the one layered card feel, so I went ahead and dried this panel off camera pretty extensively, but you're going to see that apparently I didn't do a good enough job here very quickly. I'm using a sentiment from the same stamp set as the clovers, and I'm just getting it lined up there. But my thought was that I really wanted an intense black image, and so I thought I would use embossing powder, but look at that. It ended up sticking to the white pigment ink even though I really dried it back. And I'm thinking it's the combination of the embossing ink not being set with embossing powder or some kind of other substance, and then the white pigment ink, it's going to be wet for a little longer. So I pulled out the Versafine Clair and Nocturne, and that ended up working really, really well because it's a pigment based ink. It blended over top of that other pigment very, very well. So I went ahead and did dry that again off camera so that it wouldn't smudge because I have a tendency to smudge things, and I actually think I end up doing that. And now it's time to create the card base. Going ahead and getting it folded. I cut all of my card bases. So I actually went ahead and decided that I was going to trim that panel down, and that's probably when I smeared it. But I did trim it down to 4 by 5 1/4. And I'm using my favorite foam tape to add a little extra dimension. This foam tape has great loft. I absolutely love it. Big Mama foam tape from Simon Says Stamp is also good if you're looking for a thinner tape, but I absolutely love the loft that this gives when I use it on card panels. Oh, there, I think I just smeared it with my thumb right back there. So I'm trying to be careful because it is still pretty wet. But then again, that's what card making is. It's imperfections and handmade touches. So it doesn't really bother me too much as long as it doesn't completely ruin the card. Now I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Gumdrop Sequins, which is a beautiful rainbow blend. I thought that would be great for the season and for the theme of the card, having a Easter feel. So here I am fiddling, my favorite thing to do in card making, fiddling to make sure that these sequins are exactly where I feel like they should be, and then it's time for glue. And that's a wrap on this card. You'll have to let me know in the comments if you've done this offset background stamping or even just stamping in general where you use a Versamark ink and an ink over top of it for that drop shadow look. I appreciate you being here today. Take care.